Chapter 19. The Search for Artificial Intelligence. The first conference on artificial intelligence was held at Dartmouth College in 1956. It explored the conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can, in principle, be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. In short, maybe those new machines called computers could rival the human mind. The grant proposal expressed the optimistic hope that a significant advance could be made in this direction if a select group of scientists were to work on the problem for a summer. There was an oft-cited precedent. The English mathematician Alan Turing thought in the 1930s that thinking machines could be constructed, and by the end of the 20th century, he believed, one will be able to speak of machines thinking without expecting to be contradicted. In 1950, he devised the Turing test. If someone behind a screen could not distinguish between human and machine responses, the machine could be considered intelligent. 60 years after the Dartmouth Conference, computers have still not passed the Turing test. Advances have been made in related areas, but there has been no sign of machines that can think or form abstractions. In fact, we still don't know how to describe human intelligence in such a way that machines can simulate it. The principal organizers of the Dartmouth Conference were two mathematicians, John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky. McCarthy was also the first to use the term artificial intelligence, AI. After a few years, he moved to Stanford and Minsky to MIT. At a 50th anniversary event celebrating the Dartmouth Conference, Max Longarella and colleagues said, "It is clear that the original goals set by the first generation of AI visionaries have not been reached. Not only is natural intelligence far from being understood, and artificial forms of intelligence so much more primitive than natural ones, but seemingly simple tasks like object manipulation and recognition, which a 3-year-old can do, have not yet been realized artificially." The writers went on to say that the cultural and social processes that have helped to shape human intelligence remain mysterious. They also noted that current robots fall far short of even very simple animals in intelligence. That was in 2006. A survey of the years 1956 to 2006 shows conflicting results. IBM's Deep Blue beat the world chess champion in 1997. But at the same time, programmers couldn't get robots to do simple things such as stack up children's bricks. Robots would try to put the top brick in place first, not understanding that other bricks must be beneath it. Maybe that's because computers really don't understand anything. That was the opinion of Lord Byron's daughter Ada, the Countess of Lovelace, who has been admired by AI researchers ever since. As a debutante in London in the 1830s, she was introduced to Charles Babbage, sometimes called the father of the computer. The Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge, Babbage hoped to build an analytical engine. A precocious student of mathematics herself, Ada Lovelace wrote up her notes describing Babbage's ideas even though the engine still had not been built. Feminists understandably have put Lovelace on a pedestal. But AI programmers have worried because she also wrote this: "The analytical engine has no pretensions whatever to originate anything. It can do whatever we know how to order it to perform." She was probably in her 20s when she wrote that plain statement, relegating computers to the status of slaves. Over 180 years later, despite much effort by PhDs from Stanford, MIT, Carnegie Mellon, and elsewhere, nothing has yet shown her comment to be out of date. AI, strong and applied. In the past half-century, an important distinction has emerged between computers that actually know something, that is, exhibit the still unattained goal of strong AI, and computers that can run a programmed sequence of tasks in order to achieve a well-defined goal, that is, exhibit applied AI. Applied AI has been a success. Robots can perform on assembly lines, and they don't need tea breaks or pensions. Computers can decipher voices over the phone and diagnose diseases. Another success has been the use of driverless vehicles. In 2005, vehicles without drivers completed a 130-mile course in the Mojave Desert, and Stanford's entry, Stanley, was one of only 5 vehicles to finish. Carrying radar, stereo cameras, 5 lasers, and GPS on board, it traveled at an average speed of 19 miles per hour and won the DARPA prize. I interviewed John McCarthy at Stanford at about the time of the Mojave contest. While on the campus at night, I caught a glimpse of a very different kind of navigation. A swift blur crossed my path. It was a fox going at about 20 miles an hour, with utter self-assurance and little light to steer by. No GPS, lasers, or computers on board either. So how did it acquire that software? On a related theme, George Gilder wrote in The Silicon Eye, "A fly can do flawless flip landings on the edge of a glass or on a glass ceiling while scarcely slowing down. Caltech computers could not even scratch the surface of the evident superiority and continuing inscrutability of the eye, brain, and nervous system of the fly. No obvious quantitative measure explained it." I asked McCarthy about the fox on the campus. How did its internal computer get programmed? "Well, it has had trillions of trials over many millions of years," he said. "It would be very interesting to know how good the first mammals were, which might be ascertainable. The past is turning out to be less impenetrable than we imagined." He mentioned intelligent design, but he found Discovery Institute's website disappointing because all of its links were to polemics against evolution rather than taking their own ideas seriously. ID theory has advanced since then. He considered it possible that the actions of a designer, or intervener as he put it, could be investigated using the methods of science. He also allowed that almost all who work on AI are materialists. Everything is assumed to be physical, the mind included. A physical description of the brain can yield a complete account of mental states, he thought. McCarthy told me he is a materialist himself. In 2003, the Washington Post columnist Charles Krauthammer elaborated on the materialist case. It seemed obvious to him that machines will achieve consciousness. "After all, we did, and with very humble beginnings. In biology, neurons started firing millions of years ago, allowing tiny mindless organisms to move about, avoid noxious stimuli, etc. But when enough of those neurons were put together with enough complexity, all of a sudden you got us. A cartoon balloon pops up above that mass of individually unconscious neurons and says, 'I exist.' In principle, why should that not eventually occur with silicon? The number of chips and complexity of their interaction will no doubt be staggering and may require centuries to construct, but I do not see why silicon cannot make the same transition from unconsciousness to consciousness that carbon did." I asked McCarthy how he thought artificial intelligence had fared 50 years after the Dartmouth conference. "I have to say that I was over-optimistic," he said. "In my proposals in the 1960s, I expected to accomplish things within 3 years that haven't been done to this day." Another Dartmouth participant, Herbert Simon, predicted, as long ago as 1965, that within 20 years machines would be doing anything that a man can do. This pattern of unwarranted optimism has persisted. Arthur Clarke, writer of the sci-fi novel 2001: A Space Odyssey, also thought that AI would reach human levels. In 1999, however, he postponed that development until after 2020. By then, he thought there would be 2 intelligent species on planet Earth, one evolving far more rapidly than biology would ever permit. It hasn't happened yet. By the time he wrote The Society of Mind in 1985, Minsky still shared the materialistic outlook that almost all of the founding AI generation accept. "Minds are simply what brains do," he said. The singularity. The leading enthusiast for strong AI has been the utopian futurist Ray Kurzweil, now with Google. A student of Minsky's, he developed voice recognition software and made the good prediction that a computer would beat the world chess champion in 1998. It did so a year earlier. In The Age of Spiritual Machines, 1999, Kurzweil declared that the emergence of machines that exceed human intelligence in all of its broad diversity is inevitable. This would happen by 2029. Kurzweil referred to this emergence as the singularity. In a later book, The Singularity is Near, 2005, he postponed the singularity's arrival to 2045. Post-singularity, having evolved minds of their own, computers would make far more rapid progress. Human and computer minds would merge, a development known today as transhumanism. Thoughts would be downloadable, and an age of freaks would commence. Furthermore, humans would become immortal. Forbes magazine reported in 2009 that Kurzweil, who was born in 1948, consumed between 180 and 250 pills a day so that he would live to see the singularity. He has relied on Moore's law. Computing power doubles every 18 months. His book, How to Create a Mind, The Secret of Human Thought Revealed, was published in 2012. Yet we still don't begin to know how to create a mind. Kurzweil's basic error was to assume that quantitative additions will bring about qualitative changes. He thought we could expect a growth in complexity to transform itself into an entirely new kind of substance. In 2000, Bill Joy, then with Sun Microsystems, put a pessimistic spin onto Kurzweil's message. His anti-technology diatribe, Why the Future Doesn't Need Us, was a 7-day marvel, praised by technologists who should have known better. Joy declared that robotics, nanotechnology, and genetic engineering would gang up on us. It is no exaggeration to say that we are on the cusp of the further perfection of extreme evil, he wrote. John McCarthy ignored that joyless message, but told me that he rejected Kurzweil's vision. He imagines that there is a Moore's law of artificial intelligence. Everything doubles in 18 months? I don't see that, either as a characteristic of the past or of the future. Then again, some expert systems have been a great success, McCarthy added. Many companies now support AI departments. The Google search engine, when it prompts us with "Did you mean?" demonstrates applied AI. A more plausible worry is not that computers will start telling us what to do, but that they will cause unemployment. But others are confident that new technology creates more jobs than it sheds. I asked McCarthy about the difficulty of stacking bricks. Robots can easily do that today, he said. Nonetheless, the method employed doesn't correspond to human common sense knowledge about objects. Picking up bricks, yes. Picking up cats, no. Robots can't do that. Not even dead cats. Common sense, uncommon difficulty. In the gulf separating strong and applied AI, there is a paradox. Computers can easily and quickly do things that humans can do only slowly. Multiply two large numbers, for example. In contrast, computers cannot do things that humans, and sometimes animals too, can do easily, and often without thinking at all. Small children know millions of things they learned in the first 3 years of life, without anyone having to teach them. We call it common sense. But it has turned out to be one of the great unsolved problems for AI. Feeding it into computers is extraordinarily difficult. Since 1984, Psycorp CEO Douglas Lynott and his assistants have been encoding common sense knowledge, the literally millions of things that small children know but that are normally too obvious to spell out. 2 examples: people who die stay dead, and nothing can be in 2 places at once. Lynott gave this example. If you are carrying a container that's open on one side, you should carry it with the open end up, especially if it contains water. The idea is to represent such a basic understanding of life in formal logic as opposed to English sentences. Machines are supposed to crank through the deductions from these logical statements. By 2002, Lewontin told Computer World Sci-Corp had put in 600 person-years of effort, and we've assembled a knowledge base containing 3 million rules of thumb that the average person knows about the world, plus about 300,000 terms or concepts. But there was still a long way to go. The Sci-Corp project, Psych, then contained only about 2% of the information its designers thought necessary to operate with something like human intelligence. Lewontin, funded by Microsoft billionaire Paul Allen, said, in Daniel Crevier's book AI, The Tumultuous History of the Search for Artificial Intelligence, that no one in 2015 would dream of buying a machine without common sense. Well, 2015 has come and gone, and we still have to use our own intelligence and common sense to use the latest computers. But they still only do what they are told, if we are lucky, and nothing crashes. By 2001, Marvin Minsky had become almost as disillusioned as McCarthy. As far as I know, Minsky said, no computer knows that you can use a string to pull an object, but not to push it. You probably shouldn't eat string. And, if you tie a box with it, you should have put the stuff in it before. The point is, there are a whole lot of things you know about string. There's been only one large project to do something about the common sense problem, and that's the famous Psych project of Douglas Lewontin. He's coming along, but if you look at Psych, it still can't do any extensive amount of 5-year-old type common sense reasoning. The frame problem. A related difficulty is called the frame problem. If an intelligent program is to work, it must be able to infer that certain events will follow from a given action. But computerized inferences tend to be extremely literal. Therefore, the relevant consequences of a specified action must be spelled out, and the irrelevant ones ignored. McCarthy found, for example, that in proving that one person could talk to another after looking up his phone number, we were obliged to add the hypothesis that if a person has a telephone, he still has it after looking up a number in the telephone book. To get this right, computer-programmed AI must know the context of an action. When we do one thing in the real world, many external things change, but most of those changes are irrelevant. Knowing which are relevant and which are not has turned out to be difficult. And if all changes have to be spelled out, the problem becomes insoluble. It raises basic questions about the applicability of formal logic to everyday life. A parallel problem arises with natural selection. See my Chapter 5. A changed environment may be advantageous to an organism, or it may not. Robotics encounters another difficulty. A robot can compute its new location when it moves. But if there is any wheel spinning, a discrepancy will open up between its real and its calculated position. After a few such displacements, an early robot called Shaky soon lost track of its location and would bump into walls. Yet, in an exaggeration that has characterized almost all reporting on AI, Life magazine in 1970 called Shaky the first electronic person, capable of traveling about the moon for months at a time. In fact, it could barely negotiate straight corridors, said Daniel Crevier. Rodney Brooks, the CEO of Rethink Robotics, aimed to disagree with McCarthy and Minsky, who wanted to establish a proper foundation before proceeding with robotics. Brooks thought that such preparation had gone on long enough, with little success. Maybe it would be better to put robots out into the real world and hope for the best. Children learn from their environment, so maybe robots would too. Brooks told an interviewer in 1997, "What we've been able to do is build robots that operate in the world, in unstructured environments, and do pretty well, because they use whatever structure there is in the world to get the tasks done." But in one of Minsky's talks, "It's 2001, where's Hal?" his frustration was plain. HAL, for those who never saw the movie, was the malign computer in 2001 who decided to kill off the crew of the spaceship heading toward Jupiter. Here's what Minsky said. "Tell me something that you've learned from building a physical robot, and I'll tell you someone in the 1970s who wrote a paper on that." So the student is wasting a whole year, or 3 years, soldering connections and working with bad components. Every now and then the robot will go down the hall and actually find a door and go through it. But you don't know why, because next time it won't. That's why you'll find that these robotics people treasure their videos, because it won't work tomorrow. Minsky warned researchers going into AI, if you see a student who says, "I'm building another robot," tell him 40,000 people are doing that. In 15 years, they've discovered 5 things, giving them the benefit of the doubt. In the Society of Mind, Minsky's ideas were only tangential to AI. Yet he was right to insist that if computers are to know how to perceive objects and decide whether to ignore them or pay attention, we must first understand how humans solve the same problem. Sending robots forth to blunder about in the world and learn by their mistakes was a counsel of despair. Nothing came of it. In comments published in his Washington Post obituary, Marvin Minsky's disappointment was plain. What about IBM's much-hyped machine, Watson? Wasn't that artificial intelligence, he was once asked? "I wouldn't call it anything," he replied. "An ad hoc question-answering machine." Mind and materialism. What does David Gelernter think about these matters? A computer science professor at Yale, he was wounded in 1993 when he opened a package mailed by the Unabomber. His father, Herbert Gelernter, participated in the original Dartmouth Conference. "Strong AI was bound to fail," David Gelernter once said. Alan Turing and his followers were naive about the mind, at least at the start. They didn't grasp the existence of mental states, of an inner mental world, intentional states of consciousness. Building a mind simulator in software and expecting it to think made no more sense than the idea of building a thunderstorm simulator and expecting it to get everyone wet. No reason has ever been adduced for believing that anyone will ever be able to build a conscious mind out of electronics. Materialism is the foundation on which the whole notion of thinking machines was built. Gelernter reviewed the topic in The Closing of the Scientific Mind, published in Commentary, January 2014. He invoked Thomas Nagel's Mind and Cosmos, Why the Materialist Neo-Darwinian Conception of Nature is Almost Certainly False, 2012. Nagel argued that Darwinism cannot explain the emergence of consciousness, the capacity to feel or experience the world. But as Gelernter pointed out, Nagel was immediately set upon by all the leading punks, bullies, and hangers-on of the philosophical underworld. Gelernter continued, "Attacking Darwin is the sin against the Holy Ghost that pious scientists are taught never to forgive. Even worse, Nagel is an atheist, but unwilling to express sufficient hatred of religion to satisfy other atheists. There is nothing religious about Nagel's speculations. He believes that science has not come far enough to explain consciousness and that it must press on. He believes that Darwin is not sufficient." Gelernter also derided the Kurzweil cult, the belief that machine intelligence will dominate human intelligence to the extent that men will no longer understand machines any more than potato chips understand mathematical topology. In the commentary article, Gelernter said, "Whether he knows it or not, Kurzweil believes in and longs for the death of mankind. Because if things work out as he predicts, there will still be life on Earth, but no human life. To predict that a man who lives forever and is built mainly of semiconductors is still a man is like predicting that a man with stainless steel skin, a small nuclear reactor for a stomach, and an IQ of 10,000 would still be a man. In fact, we have no idea what he would be." The great problem with the Kurzweil cult, Gelernter added, is that there is no reason to believe that progress in any field will continue, much less accelerate. The truth is that machines do just what we tell them to. which is exactly what Ada, the Countess of Lovelace, said in the 1830s. It seems that not much has changed since then. Actually, one thing has changed. Darwinism has intervened. Ever since Darwin, we are disposed to believe that only material explanations deserve to be regarded as scientific. The mainstream view of mind nowadays, among philosophers and many scientists, is computationalism, said Gould. This view is inspired by the idea that minds are to brains as software is to computers. He reminded us that Daniel Dennett in Consciousness Explained had enjoined us to think of the brain as a computer. Gould commented that in some ways this was apt, but in other ways a crazy analogy. At any rate, it is one of the intellectual milestones of modern times. Meanwhile, we can confidently expect that computers will remain our obedient servants, whether they are under our desks or strapped to our wrists, and operating with an ever-widening range of applications. As to their becoming intelligent or conscious, that will never happen. Nonetheless, the search for strong AI was a worthwhile endeavor, if only because it has helped us appreciate at least some of the marvels of the human mind.